Black woman accused of boarding with forged papers. She reveals she's the airline's legal advisor. An ordinary flight turns into a confrontation that exposes deep-rooted prejudice and sparks a powerful fight for justice. When a confident passenger is wrongly accused and humiliated, she doesn't just defend herself, she sets the stage for a reckoning that shakes the entire airline. What unfolds next is a story of courage, accountability, and consequences. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now let's get into it. The airport hummed with the rhythm of controlled chaos. The chatter of travelers mingled with the robotic announcements echoing through the high-ceilinged terminal. Elena Uyil moved through it all with quiet elegance, her polished black heels clicking softly against the gleaming marble floors. Her posture was straight, her steps deliberate, and her head held high, not out of arrogance, but with the assurance of someone who had fought her way to where she was. Elena's dark brown skin glowed under the fluorescent lights, a testament to the meticulous care she poured into her appearance. Her hair was styled into a sleek bun at the nape of her neck, revealing sharp cheekbones and piercing eyes that seemed to take in everything and give away nothing. Dressed in a tailored pantsuit with subtle pinstripes, she carried an understated leather briefcase that hinted at her professional prowess. Around her wrist, a simple gold bracelet gleamed, a gift from her late mother, always worn as a reminder of her roots. She paused at a kiosk to check her ticket, her fingers brushing over the embossed lettering, First Class. A faint smile curved her lips, not because of the seat, but because it symbolized how far she had come. From a modest upbringing in a small town, Elena had defied the odds, excelling in law school and building a reputation as a formidable legal mind. Her position as chief legal advisor for one of the world's largest airlines was not just a title, it was a statement of resilience. Elena wasn't one to flaunt her achievements. In fact, she preferred to stay under the radar, but today, she felt a strange tension in the air. It wasn't the usual pre-flight nerve. She was no stranger to traveling. Instead, it was an undercurrent of something unspoken, an unease she couldn't quite place. She approached the boarding gate, her ticket ready in hand. The gate was a hub of activity, with passengers lining up in neat rows, their conversations punctuated by the occasional laugh or complaint. Elena stayed off to the side, observing. She wasn't in a rush. Her time was meticulously planned. As she waited, her gaze drifted to the staff working behind the counter. A middle-aged flight attendant with a tight bun and sharp features seemed to be scanning the crowd, her expression bordering on disapproval. Elena noted how her eyes lingered on certain passengers, those who looked like her. Elena's faint smile faded. The weight of others' judgment wasn't new to her. As a black woman in a predominantly white corporate world, she had endured the stares, the whispered doubts, the outright dismissals, but she had learned to let her actions speak louder than the assumptions of others. Still, moments like this, when bias floated just beneath the surface, reminded her that the fight was never truly over. Elena glanced at her watch, a slim, elegant piece that ticked with the precision she admired. The numbers told her it was almost time to board. She straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath, drawing on the inner calm she had cultivated over years of navigating hostile environments. Her focus shifted to the briefcase in her hand, its contents a testament to her meticulous nature. Contracts, legal documents, and a notebook filled with ideas for the airline's upcoming diversity initiative. Elena had always believed in action over words, and she was determined to leave a legacy that would outlast her tenure. The faint murmur of voices around her grew louder, pulling her attention back to the present. Elena noticed the flight attendant, the same woman who had been scanning the crowd, glancing her way. The look wasn't welcoming. It was sharp, assessing, as though Elena's very presence needed justification. Elena felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the briefcase and prepared to move forward when the announcement came. Her lips pressed into a firm line as she reminded herself, stay calm, stay composed, always one step ahead. Today was supposed to be a routine flight, a quick trip for a meeting with the airline's executives, but the tension in the air told her otherwise. Somewhere, Deep in her gut, Elena knew this journey would be anything but ordinary. The boarding announcement rang out over the speakers, crisp and indifferent. First-class passengers may now proceed to board. Elena exhaled slowly, smoothing the front of her tailored jacket. She picked up her briefcase, its weight a reassuring anchor, and stepped forward toward the gate. The line for first-class passengers was short, and as Elena approached the counter, she noticed the same flight attendant, Sarah, according to the gold nameplate pinned to her blazer, standing behind the desk. Sarah's lips tightened slightly when Elena handed over her boarding pass and ID, a flicker of disdain flashing in her eyes before she masked it with professional indifference. Elena maintained her composure, silently watching as Sarah's gaze darted between the boarding pass and the ID. Something about Sarah's demeanor felt off. There was a deliberate slowness to her movements, a subtle but unmistakable scrutiny in her eyes. "Is there a problem?" Elena asked, her voice calm yet firm, laced with the authority of someone used to handling confrontations. Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she held the boarding pass up to the light, squinting at it as though inspecting for invisible flaws. Then she glanced at Elena's ID again before finally looking up. Her expression was unreadable, but her tone was clipped and accusatory. "Where did you get this boarding pass?" Sarah asked, her words carrying an implied suspicion that made Elena's stomach tighten. Elena blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I booked it through the airline," she replied, keeping her tone even. "Is there an issue?" Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "It just seems unusual. I'll need to verify this." She stepped away from the counter without waiting for a response, carrying Elena's documents with her. Elena stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. Around her, the murmurs of other passengers began to rise, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected delay. Elena took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay composed. "This can't be what I think it is," she told herself, but deep down, she couldn't ignore the familiar prickle of indignation crawling up her spine. She was no stranger to moments like these, moments when her competence, her legitimacy, even her very presence, were questioned without cause. Sarah returned a few minutes later, accompanied by a security officer in a crisp uniform. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his expression a mask of detached authority. He carried a clipboard, which he glanced at briefly before addressing Elena. "Ma'am," he began, his tone as formal as it was condescending. "We've been informed that there's a potential issue with your boarding pass and identification." Elena's heart skipped a beat, but her face remained calm. "A potential issue?" she echoed, her voice sharper now. "What kind of issue?" Sarah crossed her arms, standing slightly behind the security officer as though seeking refuge in his presence. "It doesn't seem authentic," she said, her words slow and deliberate, as if she were testing them out. "We've had instances of forged documents in the past, and we need to ensure everything checks out." Elena's jaw tightened. The accusation hung in the air like a thick fog, heavy and suffocating. She glanced at the growing crowd of onlookers, some openly staring, others pretending not to while stealing glances. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to judgment, and every pair of eyes felt like a weight pressing down on her. "This is absurd," Elena said, her voice steady but firm. "My documents are authentic, and I don't appreciate being treated like a criminal." The security officer's expression didn't change. "We're just following protocol, ma'am. If you'll come with us, we can sort this out." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elena felt the heat of their scrutiny, but she refused to let it show. She straightened her shoulders, her gaze locked onto Sarah's. "And what exactly makes you think my documents are forged?" she demanded. Sarah hesitated, her confidence wavering for just a moment before she replied, "They don't match the usual profile for first-class passengers." Elena's breath caught in her chest. The words were like a slap, their meaning clear even if unspoken. She stared at Sarah, the anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior threatening to spill over. "This is unacceptable," Elena said, her voice cold now. "I demand to speak with a supervisor." The security officer stepped in before Sarah could respond. "Ma'am, please let's not make a scene." Elena's eyes narrowed. "I'm not making a scene. I'm defending myself against an unfounded accusation." The tension in the air was palpable, the silence between her words stretching long enough for everyone to hear. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her confidence faltering under Elena's unwavering gaze. Finally, the security officer gestured toward a side hallway. If you'll just come with us, we can resolve this quickly. Elena hesitated, her mind racing. She considered refusing, standing her ground right there at the gate, but the weight of the stairs around her made her pause. The last thing she wanted was to give them more of a spectacle. Fine, she said at last, her tone clipped. She turned to the crowd, her gaze sweeping over them. But this isn't over. With that, she picked up her briefcase and followed the security officer, her steps measured but firm. She didn't look back, even as she felt the burn of the onlookers' eyes following her down the hall. As they disappeared from view, Sarah exhaled shakily, her hands trembling slightly, but the look of satisfaction in her eyes was unmistakable. She thought she'd won. Elena, however, knew better. She'd been through enough battles to recognize the game, and she wasn't about to let herself lose, not this time. The hallway they led her into was sterile and dimly lit, a stark contrast to the bustling vibrance of the terminal she had just left. Each step echoed, the sound bouncing off the tiled walls like an accusation in itself. Elena held her head high, her heels clicking rhythmically, a defiant soundtrack to her forced walk of shame. She could feel the weight of the security officer's presence behind her, his silence unnerving. Ahead, a small room with frosted glass windows came into view. The officer opened the door without a word, motioning for Elena to step inside. She entered the space, taking in the sparse furniture. A metal table bolted to the floor, 2 hard chairs, and a security camera mounted in the corner, its blinking red light a silent observer to countless interrogations. The officer closed the door behind them, the soft click of the lock sending a ripple of tension through the room. Elena placed her briefcase carefully on the table, the gesture deliberate, as if asserting her control over the situation despite the circumstances. "Have a seat, ma'am," the officer said, his tone more a command than a request. Elena remained standing. "I'd rather not, until someone explains to me what this is really about," she replied, her voice calm but edged with steel. The officer exchanged a glance with Sarah, who had followed them into the room and now stood against the wall, arms crossed. Her earlier bravado seemed to have returned, and she regarded Elena with the smug confidence of someone who believed they held all the power. "Your boarding pass and ID raised some red flags," the officer said, flipping through a clipboard he had brought with him. "We've had issues with fraud lately, and we have to be thorough." Elena raised an eyebrow, folding her arms across her chest. "Thorough? Is that what you call profiling passengers based on assumptions?" The officer's expression didn't waver, but Sarah's smirk faltered for a moment. "This isn't about profiling," Sarah interjected, her voice defensive. "It's about ensuring the safety and integrity of our flights." Elena's gaze snapped to Sarah, her eyes narrowing. "And what exactly about me screams unsafe, Sarah? My professional attire? My calm demeanor? Or is it just the color of my skin?" The tension in the room thickened, the silence that followed her words heavy and oppressive. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but quickly closed it, her cheeks flushing with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "I'd advise you to cooperate, ma'am," the officer said, attempting to regain control of the situation. "The sooner we sort this out, the sooner you can be on your way." Elena exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay composed. Every fiber of her being wanted to lash out, to let her anger and frustration spill over, but she knew that wouldn't serve her. Instead, she stepped closer to the table, her movements measured and deliberate. "I've been more than cooperative," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not going to sit here and let you treat me like a criminal without evidence. So, unless you have proof that my documents are anything other than authentic, I suggest you stop wasting my time." The officer hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. Sarah, however, took a step forward, her confidence bolstered by the perceived authority of the uniform beside her. "Your attitude isn't helping," Sarah said, her tone sharp. "If you have nothing to hide, then why are you making this so difficult?" Elena turned to Sarah, her gaze piercing. "Difficult? You dragged me out of line, humiliated me in front of dozens of passengers, and accused me of a crime I didn't commit. And now you're telling me I'm the one being difficult?" The words hung in the air, each one landing like a blow. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, but before she could respond, the door opened, and another figure stepped into the room. It was a supervisor, judging by the crispness of his uniform and the confident way he carried himself. His badge read, "Brian Kiley, Lead Security." His sharp blue eyes quickly assessed the scene, lingering on Elena before turning to the officer. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone authoritative but not unkind. "Routine check, sir," the officer replied, standing a little straighter. "We're verifying this passenger's documents." Brian's gaze returned to Elena, his expression unreadable. "May I see them?" Elena opened her briefcase, extracting the documents she had handed over earlier. She placed them on the table, her movements deliberate, and stepped back to allow him to inspect them. Brian picked them up, examining the boarding pass and ID with a practiced eye. His brow furrowed slightly, but not in the way Sarah had hoped. "These look fine to me," he said after a moment, his tone neutral. He turned to the officer. "What exactly is the issue?" Sarah stepped forward, her confidence faltering under Brian's scrutiny. "I thought they looked suspicious," she stammered, avoiding Elena's gaze. Brian raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious in what way?" Sarah hesitated, clearly floundering. "Well, it didn't seem like." "Like what?" Elena interjected, her voice cold. "Like I belonged in first class." Brian's expression hardened, and he turned to Sarah. "Is that what this is about?" "No, sir, Sarah began, but Brian held up a hand, silencing her. "I've seen enough," he said, his voice firm. "Miss Ueel, I apologize for the inconvenience. You're free to board." Elena's expression didn't waver, but a flicker of satisfaction passed through her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her tone measured. She gathered her documents, slipping them back into her briefcase. As she turned to leave, she paused, her gaze locking onto Sarah's. "This isn't over," she said quietly, her words carrying a weight that silenced the room. And with that, she walked out, her heels clicking against the floor with a confidence that couldn't be shaken. Behind her, the silence was deafening, and Sarah's face was ashen. The corridor leading back to the boarding gate felt longer than it had been on the way in. Each step echoed louder in Elena's ears, amplified by the simmering anger she kept tightly controlled. Despite Brian Kiley's intervention, the sting of humiliation lingered. Her sharp instincts told her that this ordeal wasn't truly over yet. It never was, not for someone like her. When Elena re-entered the gate area, the atmosphere had changed. The passengers who had witnessed her being escorted away now turned to look, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to thinly veiled judgment. Whispers floated in the air like the buzz of distant bees, and though she couldn't hear their exact words, she felt their weight. She walked toward the boarding line with the same deliberate confidence she had displayed earlier, her grip tightening slightly on the handle of her briefcase. The murmurs grew louder as she approached Sarah, who stood back at her post by the boarding gate. Her smirk was faint but visible, and her eyes carried a flicker of condescension as they met Elena's. Elena handed over her ticket without a word. Sarah took it with a slow, exaggerated motion, making a show of checking it once again, despite Brian Kiley having cleared it just moments ago. Her fingers lingered on the boarding pass, as if she were considering handing it back, but instead, she looked up and said, loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "Well, let's hope everything checks out this time." The statement hung in the air, barbed and dripping with implication. A ripple of murmurs passed through the line behind Elena, and a few passengers exchanged glances, their eyes darting between her and the gate attendant. Elena's jaw tightened, but she refused to rise to the bait. "You've already had your supervisor verify it," she said evenly, though her voice carried a razor-sharp edge. "Or did you forget?" Sarah's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "Just being thorough," she replied, her tone saccharine and insincere. "You can never be too careful these days." Elena didn't respond. Instead, she stepped forward toward the jet bridge, aware of the stares that followed her. She could feel the judgment radiating off the passengers like heat, each glance a silent question. What did she do to deserve that treatment? As she entered the plane, Elena immediately noticed the unusually tense atmosphere among the flight attendants. They exchanged hurried whispers and sidelong glances as she walked down the aisle toward her seat in first class. One attendant, a young woman with wide, nervous eyes, hesitated as Elena approached, her gaze flickering to someone behind her. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice faltering slightly as she gestured toward Elena's seat. "Please let us know if you need anything." Elena nodded curtly, taking her seat by the window. She placed her briefcase neatly at her feet and leaned back, exhaling a measured breath. The tension in the air was palpable, but she wasn't about to let it rattle her. As the other first-class passengers boarded, she could feel their eyes on her. Most avoided direct contact, but their curiosity was evident in the way they lingered just a moment too long as they passed. A man in a tailored suit whispered something to the woman seated beside him, who glanced at Elena and quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing. The whispers grew louder when Sarah stepped into the cabin. Instead of discreetly performing her duties, she made a point to pause near Elena's seat, her presence a deliberate intrusion. "Ma'am," Sarah said, her voice carrying an air of exaggerated politeness that bordered on mockery. "If you need any assistance, please don't hesitate to ask. We want to ensure all our passengers feel comfortable." Elena met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'll let you know if I require anything," she replied, her tone measured but firm. Sarah lingered for a moment longer than necessary, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Then she turned and walked away, but not before casting a pointed glance at another flight attendant, who quickly looked down, her face pale. As the boarding process continued, Elena pulled out her phone, scrolling through emails with deliberate focus. She refused to give the onlookers the satisfaction of seeing her rattled, but her fingers trembled slightly, the only visible crack in her otherwise impenetrable facade. A soft, hesitant voice broke through her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Elena looked up to see the young flight attendant from earlier standing beside her seat, clutching a tray of pre-departure drinks. Her hands shook slightly, causing the glasses to rattle against the tray. "Yes?" Elena asked, her tone calm but tinged with curiosity. "I just wanted to apologize," the attendant said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for everything." Elena studied the woman for a moment, noting the genuine remorse in her eyes. "It's not your fault," she said finally, her voice softening. "But you should speak up if you see something wrong." The attendant nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing. I'll try," she said before hurrying away. Elena leaned back in her seat, her thoughts churning. "This is bigger than me," she thought, "and they need to learn that actions have consequences." As the plane prepared for takeoff, Elena's gaze drifted to the window. The city below stretched out in a grid of lights, a stark reminder of the world she had fought so hard to navigate. She knew that this was far from over. There would be a reckoning not just for Sarah, but for the system that allowed people like her to act with impunity. They would learn, one way or another. The plane roared to life, engines humming as it taxied toward the runway. Elena remained seated, her posture regal despite the undercurrent of unease lingering in the cabin. Outside the window, the city lights blurred as the aircraft gained momentum. Inside, the first-class cabin was a study in awkward silence. Conversations were hushed, the occasional glance darted her way, but no one dared to openly acknowledge her presence. As the plane ascended into the night sky, Elena leaned back and closed her eyes, not to rest, but to focus. Her thoughts raced, replaying every insult, every insinuation from the past hour. The sting of Sarah's condescension burned in her memory, but deeper than anger was a resolve, sharp and unyielding. Her moment of reflection was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah herself. Elena sensed her presence before opening her eyes. The flight attendant loomed just within her peripheral vision, her posture stiff and formal, but the faint curl of disdain in her lips betrayed her. "Miss Uil," Sarah began, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "May I get you something to drink? Champagne, perhaps?" Elena opened her eyes slowly, her expression neutral. "No, thank you," she said, her tone clipped but polite. "I'll let you know if I need anything." Sarah hesitated, as though expecting a different response. The tension between them was palpable, and the air seemed to thicken with every passing second. Finally, Sarah gave a tight nod and moved on, her heels clicking against the carpeted aisle. Elena exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to let her frustration show. It wasn't just Sarah's behavior that grated on her. It was the unspoken complicity of those around her, the other passengers, the flight crew, everyone who had seen what had happened and chosen silence. As the plane settled into its cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed, and the soft hum of conversation returned. Elena reached for her briefcase, her movements deliberate, and retrieved a leather-bound notebook. Inside were meticulously organized notes on upcoming cases, but her thoughts couldn't settle on work, not yet. Instead, she flipped to a blank page and began to write. Her pen moved swiftly, each stroke carrying the weight of her resolve. She didn't write for catharsis. She wrote for clarity, for precision. Her words were calculated, each sentence forming the foundation of what would come next. Midway through her writing, the hum of the cabin was interrupted by Sarah again, this time addressing another passenger. Elena's attention was drawn to the interaction, not because it involved her, but because Sarah's tone was markedly different, warm, accommodating, even deferential. The passenger, a white man in a tailored suit, chuckled at something Sarah said, and she laughed along, the sound grating against Elena's ears. The contrast was stark, and it stung more than Elena cared to admit. It wasn't just the way Sarah treated her, it was the way Sarah chose to treat others. The message was clear. Elena was seen as less deserving, less worthy, less human. Elena's grip on her pen tightened, the faintest tremor betraying the storm within. She set the notebook aside, unwilling to let her emotions cloud her focus. Instead, she turned her attention to the window, the endless expanse of night stretching out before her like a promise. They will learn, she thought, her resolve hardening further. The meal service began shortly after, and once again, Sarah was at the forefront. This time, however, her approach was more pointed. As she reached Elena's seat, she placed the tray down with a deliberate lack of care, the utensils rattling against the china. "Your meal, ma'am," Sarah said, her tone neutral, but her actions anything but. Elena looked at the tray, then up at Sarah. "Is there a problem, Sarah?" she asked, her voice low and calm. Sarah blinked, caught off guard. "Of course not, ma'am. Why would there be?" Elena's gaze didn't waver. "I'd like to think my presence isn't causing you discomfort." Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Elena raised a hand, silencing her. "I suggest you proceed with your duties efficiently this time." Sarah's mouth snapped shut, and she hurried away, her movements jerky with suppressed anger. Elena turned back to her meal, but the tension in the cabin had thickened. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her again, their curiosity reignited. Later in the flight, as the cabin lights dimmed further for rest, Elena took out her phone. She had been waiting for the right moment, and now it had arrived. With a few quick swipes, she opened her email and began composing a message. The recipients were carefully selected: the CEO of the airline, the head of human resources, and her direct contact in the legal department. Her message was brief but potent, detailing the events that had transpired and her immediate concerns about the behavior of certain staff members. She didn't embellish or exaggerate. The truth was damning enough. Before she hit send, she reread the email, her lips curling into a faint smile. The reckoning was beginning, and it would be thorough. As the plane began its descent, the first-class cabin stirred awake. Sarah passed through one last time, her demeanor subdued but still carrying a faint edge of hostility. When she reached Elena's seat, she hesitated. "Thank you for flying with us," Sarah said, her voice tight. Elena looked up, her expression unreadable. "Oh, I'll be flying again," she said softly, her words laced with an unspoken promise. Sarah's smile faltered, but she said nothing, moving on quickly. Elena leaned back in her seat, watching the city lights grow closer as the plane descended. Justice was in motion, and this time, she would ensure it landed exactly where it belonged, hard. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, the tires screeching faintly against the tarmac. Elena remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as she watched the other passengers begin to gather their belongings. The familiar hum of post-flight activity filled the cabin, but her mind was elsewhere, preoccupied with the steps she had already set in motion. The email she'd sent mid-flight had been a spark, but it wasn't the end. Elena had meticulously outlined the events, naming Sarah and the security officer specifically, describing their actions with precision. The chain of accountability would begin here, and she would ensure it wouldn't stop until the appropriate consequences were delivered. As the plane taxied to the gate, Sarah appeared once more, making her way through the cabin with forced politeness. Her gaze flickered toward Elena as she approached, and for a brief moment, something close to uncertainty flashed across her face, but it was fleeting, replaced quickly by her usual, thinly veiled contempt. "Thank you for flying with us, Miss Uil," Sarah said, her voice tightly controlled. "We hope you had a pleasant experience." Elena's eyes met Sarah's, steady and unblinking. "I'd say it was enlightening," she replied, her tone neutral but laced with meaning. Sarah hesitated, her grip tightening on the edge of a seat for balance. But before she could respond, Elena turned her attention back to her briefcase, effectively dismissing her. The quiet authority in her demeanor left Sarah visibly unsettled as she continued down the aisle. The first-class passengers began to disembark, their movements languid and unhurried. Elena waited patiently, letting the crowd thin out before rising to her feet. She adjusted her blazer, picked up her briefcase, and stepped into the aisle. As she exited the plane, the air of the terminal hit her, cool and fresh compared to the cabin. She walked with measured steps, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she approached the baggage claim. The rhythmic sound echoed in her mind like a countdown, each step bringing her closer to what she knew was coming. At the baggage carousel, Elena stood apart from the others, her posture impeccable as she watched the suitcases roll by. A sleek black carry-on appeared, and she retrieved it with ease, her movements graceful and efficient. As she straightened, her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. The email response was instantaneous, as she had anticipated. The subject line alone, urgent matter, immediate action required, told her everything she needed to know. She opened it with a flick of her thumb, her sharp eyes scanning the text. It was from the airline's legal department, a formal acknowledgement of her report. The tone was professional and concise, but Elena could read between the lines. They understood the gravity of her position not just as a passenger, but as their chief legal advisor, and they were scrambling to contain the fallout. Her lips curved into a faint, satisfied smile as she read the final line. "We will convene an emergency meeting to address this matter immediately." As Elena exited the terminal, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out, opening the door for her with a polite nod. She slid into the back seat, setting her briefcase beside her. As the city lights blurred past the tinted windows, inside the car, Elena's mind churned, replaying every detail of the flight. She didn't just want justice for herself, she wanted systemic change. The events of the day weren't isolated. They were a symptom of a deeper issue, one she had long fought against in her career. She picked up her phone again, this time dialing a direct line. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Miss Ueel," the voice said, slightly hesitant. "I received your email. This is concerning." Elena's tone was calm, but unyielding. Concerning is an understatement. "This incident wasn't just about me. It's about the culture your airline has allowed to fester." There was a pause on the other end, and she could almost hear the gears turning. "We take this very seriously," the voice replied. "I assure you, appropriate action will be taken." Elena leaned back in her seat, her gaze fixed on the passing skyline. "It had better be," she said softly, "because if it's not, I'll ensure the consequences extend far beyond your staff." The line went silent for a moment before the voice returned, more measured now. "Understood. We'll keep you updated." Elena ended the call, her grip on the phone tightening slightly. This was only the beginning. The car pulled into the driveway of a modern high-rise building, its facade gleaming under the city lights. Elena stepped out, her briefcase in hand, and entered the lobby. The elevator ride to her apartment was quiet, the soft hum of the machinery a soothing contrast to the chaos of the day. When she entered her apartment, she set her things down and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the sprawling city below. The skyline was a testament to ambition and resilience, and it reminded her of her own journey. She had faced countless obstacles, but each one had only strengthened her resolve. Tonight, she would rest. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The airline needed to learn. Sarah needed to learn that actions had consequences. Elena would ensure this incident became a catalyst for change not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been treated as less. As she turned away from the window, a faint smile played on her lips. Justice was coming, and it would land harder than any of them expected. She would make sure of it. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Elena's apartment, casting long, golden streaks across the polished wood floor. She sat at her sleek glass desk, sipping a cup of black coffee, the bitter taste grounding her as she prepared for what the day would bring. The events of the previous day replayed in her mind, each detail sharpening her focus. Today wasn't just about setting things right for herself. It was about dismantling the toxic environment that allowed Sarah's behavior to thrive. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She reached for it, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly as she read the name on the screen. It was a senior executive from the airline's corporate office. "Good morning," she answered, her tone neutral but firm. "Good morning, Miss Uil," the voice on the other end said, tight with a mix of formality and unease. "We've reviewed your report, and I wanted to assure you that we're treating this matter with the utmost seriousness. We've already scheduled a meeting with the involved staff, including the flight attendant in question." Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. "Good," she replied. "I'll be joining that meeting." There was a pause, a hesitation she recognized all too well. "Of course," the executive said finally, though his tone suggested he hadn't anticipated her direct involvement. "The meeting is scheduled for this afternoon at our headquarters. I'll ensure everything is prepared." Elena ended the call, her mind already mapping out the confrontation ahead. She wouldn't approach this as merely a passenger airing grievances. She would step into that room as the chief legal advisor, armed with authority and an unflinching commitment to justice. Later that day, Elena arrived at the airline's headquarters, a towering glass structure that loomed over the bustling city streets. She walked through the lobby with purposeful strides, her heels clicking against the marble floor, drawing glances from employees who instinctively stepped aside. She was a force to be reckoned with, and it showed in every movement. The executive, a tall man in a sharp gray suit, greeted her at the elevator bank. His demeanor was polished but nervous, his smile strained as he extended a hand. "Miss Uil, thank you for coming," he said, his voice overly accommodating. "We've gathered everyone in the boardroom." Elena shook his hand briefly, her expression cool. "Lead the way." The boardroom was a stark contrast to the bustling office floors outside. It was quiet, the air thick with tension, as Elena entered. At the far end of the long, polished table sat Sarah, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her confidence from the previous day nowhere to be found. Beside her was the security officer who had escorted Elena off the plane. His eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding her gaze. The executive gestured for Elena to take a seat at the head of the table, a position of authority she accepted without hesitation. She set her briefcase down, her movements deliberate, as she retrieved a stack of neatly organized documents. "We're here to address a serious breach of conduct," Elena began, her voice calm but commanding. "Not just against me, but against the values this airline claims to uphold." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands twisting in her lap. The security officer glanced at her, then at Elena, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed nervously. Elena's gaze locked onto Sarah's. "Your actions on that flight were not only unprofessional, but discriminatory. You made assumptions about me based on nothing but bias." When confronted with Elena's gaze locked onto Sarah's, "Your actions on that flight were not only unprofessional, but discriminatory. You made assumptions about me based on nothing but bias." When confronted with evidence that contradicted your assumptions, you doubled down instead of admitting your error. Maria's mouth opened slightly, as if to protest, but Elena raised a hand, silencing her. "I'm not here to hear excuses," Elena continued, her tone unwavering. "I'm here to ensure accountability." She turned her attention to the security officer. "And your willingness to act on baseless accusations without conducting a proper assessment speaks volumes about the systemic failures within this organization." The room was silent, the weight of Elena's words hanging heavily in the air. The executive shifted nervously in his chair, clearly caught between wanting to diffuse the tension and knowing Elena was right. "I've outlined a series of steps this airline must take to prevent incidents like this from happening again," Elena said, sliding a folder across the table. "This includes mandatory anti-discrimination training for all staff, a review of hiring and promotional practices, and an anonymous reporting system for employees and passengers to address bias and misconduct." She paused, letting her words sink in. "And as for Sarah and the security officer, I expect immediate action to be taken. This behavior cannot be tolerated." Sarah's face was ashen, her earlier smugness replaced by a mix of fear and shame. She began, but her voice faltered. "I didn't mean to." "Intent doesn't erase impact," Elena interrupted, her voice cutting through Sarah's stammering. "What you meant is irrelevant. What you did is what matters." The security officer cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. I just followed protocol." Elena's gaze turned icy. then it's clear that the protocol needs to change. But let me be clear, you had a choice. You chose to act without evidence, and that choice has consequences. By the time the meeting ended, the weight of Elena's presence had left an indelible mark on everyone in the room. The executive promised swift action, his voice trembling slightly as he assured her that the airline would implement her recommendations immediately. Elena rose from her seat, gathering her documents with the same deliberate precision that had carried her through the entire ordeal. As she turned to leave, she paused by Sarah's chair, her gaze steady. "Learn from this," Elena said softly, her voice carrying an unspoken warning. "Because the next time you let your bias dictate your actions, there might not be anyone willing to give you a second chance." Sarah didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Elena stepped out of the boardroom, the tension in her shoulders easing as she walked toward the elevator. The fight wasn't over, but a significant battle had been won. Justice, she knew, wasn't just about punishment. It was about creating lasting change. And today, she had taken the first step in ensuring that change would come. As the elevator doors closed, Elena allowed herself a faint smile. They would remember her, not just as a victim, but as a force to be reckoned with. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Elena's apartment, painting golden streaks across the polished wooden floor. She sat at her sleek glass desk, a steaming cup of black coffee in hand. The events of the previous day played in her mind like a vivid reel, sharpening her focus. Today wasn't just about accountability. It was about paving the way for systemic change. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Elena picked it up and glanced at the screen. The name displayed belonged to a senior executive from the airline's corporate office. "Good morning," she answered, her voice calm and steady. "Good morning, Miss Uil," the executive said, his tone measured but laced with unease. "We've reviewed your report, and I want to assure you that we're addressing this matter with the utmost urgency. A meeting has been arranged this afternoon with the involved staff." Elena's lips pressed into a faint line. "I'll be joining that meeting," she said firmly. There was a brief pause, likely from surprise. "Of course," the executive said, though the hesitation in his voice was evident. "We'll be ready for your input." Elena ended the call and set her coffee down. Her mind was already moving, strategizing. This wasn't just about confronting Sarah or the security officer. It was about addressing the systemic failures that had allowed their behavior to go unchecked. She had prepared meticulously, as always, and today, she intended to make an impact. Later that day, Elena arrived at the airline's headquarters, a sleek glass tower that loomed over the city streets. She walked through the bustling lobby with purpose, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Employees parted instinctively as she passed, their gazes lingering on her commanding presence. A tall, sharply dressed executive met her at the elevator bank. His smile was polite but strained, a sign of the tension surrounding the meeting. "Miss Uil, thank you for coming," he said, extending a hand. "The boardroom is ready." Elena gave a curt nod, shaking his hand briefly. "Let's get started." The boardroom was spacious and modern, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping view of the city. Despite the room's open design, the atmosphere was stifling with attention. Seated at the long, polished table were Sarah, pale and visibly shaken, and the security officer, his posture stiff and defensive. Elena entered the room with quiet authority, setting her briefcase down at the head of the table. The executive gestured for her to take her seat, but she remained standing for a moment, scanning the room. Her gaze lingered on Sarah, whose hands twisted nervously in her lap, and then on the security officer, whose eyes darted anywhere but toward her. When she finally sat, the room seemed to hold its breath. "We're here today," Elena began, her voice measured but commanding, "to address a serious breach of conduct. This isn't just about what happened to me as an individual. It's about the broader implications of allowing bias and unprofessionalism to fester unchecked within this organization." Sarah shifted in her seat, her face reddening. She opened her mouth to speak, but Elena raised a hand, silencing her. "I'm not here to entertain excuses," Elena said sharply. "I'm here to ensure accountability." She turned her attention to the security officer. "Your willingness to act on baseless accusations without conducting a proper assessment reflects poorly on you and the protocols you claim to follow. What you did was not just unprofessional, it was reckless." The officer swallowed hard, his face pale. Sarah, meanwhile, looked down at her lap, her earlier defiance replaced by visible shame. Elena slid a folder across the table toward the executive. In this folder are my recommendations for addressing not just this incident, but the underlying issues within this organization. They include mandatory anti-discrimination training for all staff, the establishment of an anonymous reporting system for bias and misconduct, and a complete review of your hiring and promotional practices. The executive nodded solemnly. We will implement these immediately, Miss Uil. As for Sarah and the security officer, Elena continued, her gaze sharp. I expect swift and decisive action. Their behavior cannot go unpunished. Sarah's head snapped up, her mouth opening in protest. I didn't mean to. Elena's gaze cut through her like a blade. Intent doesn't erase impact, Sarah. What you meant is irrelevant. What you did is what matters. The room fell silent, the weight of Elena's words hanging in the air. The executive cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly as he said, We will handle this matter appropriately, Miss Uil. You have my word. The meeting ended with promises of reform and apologies, but Elena wasn't content with just words. As she exited the boardroom, she knew the real change would come from consistent pressure and unwavering accountability. Sarah stayed behind, her face pale and her expression hollow. She had underestimated Elena, and now she would face the consequences. That evening, Elena returned to her apartment. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the city lights. The hum of traffic and the glow of neon signs felt distant, like a backdrop to her thoughts. She held a glass of wine in her hand, but she hadn't taken a sip. Her mind was preoccupied with the broader implications of the day's events. This wasn't just about one flight or one encounter. It was about paving the way for a future where people like her wouldn't have to endure the same indignities. She had started something bigger than herself, and she was determined to see it through. As she finally raised the glass to her lips, a faint smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Justice had begun, and this was only the first step. Elena Uil wasn't just a survivor of prejudice. She was its undoing, and the world would remember her for it. Elena didn't just demand justice for herself. She became the catalyst for systemic change, proving that standing up against prejudice can lead to a better future for everyone. Her courage turned a moment of humiliation into a lasting legacy of accountability and progress. If stories like this inspire you to believe in the power of resilience and justice, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that challenges injustice and reminds us all to strive for a fairer world.